Hey everyone, and thanks for joining us for our fourth lesson in our study of the book of Ephesians together. So far, we've seen how the gospel has transformed our lives and the implications that has for our relationships. And in chapter 4, Paul is going to continue to teach us that who we are should transform how we live, which is the big idea we've been looking at for the book of Ephesians together in our study so far. Again, if you've missed the first 3 lessons, go ahead over to our YouTube channel, and there should be a playlist where all of our Ephesians studies are. You can go there and catch up on any lessons that you have missed, and then come back to this lesson in chapter 4. And if we think about the book of Ephesians as a whole, chapters 1 through 3, the first half of Ephesians, Paul is describing a lot of heavy content. He's going into a lot of detail, a lot of theological things that many scholars have struggled to understand over the course of time. And it's a very heavy content section, chapters 1 through 3. But as we shift into chapters 4 through 6 and studying them and thinking about them, Paul changes his approach a little bit from a content-heavy focus to a practical-heavy focus. So I think you're going to really, really enjoy the second half of the book of Ephesians as we get a little more and more practical in each chapter. So let's dive into chapter 4 together. And we're going to look at 4 key verses in chapter 4. And the first 2 verses we're going to look at are Ephesians 4, 3, and 4, which says this: "Make every effort to keep the unity of the Spirit through the bond of peace. There is one body and one Spirit, just as you were called to one hope when you were called." And so Paul is coming back to this idea of unity that was so prevalent in chapter 3, because he's still working on instructing the Jews and the Gentiles how to live together in unity rather than division, because it's clearly something that they were struggling with, because Paul brings it up over and over and over again. But now in chapter 4, he's going to bring it up in a little bit of a different way. He's not just going to describe that Christ has offered salvation to all people, and so therefore all people have the opportunity to become part of the family of God, but also Paul is going to describe how that unity is possible through God. And that unity is possible because God has made all one. God has bridged the gap, and that's the theme that we're going to see across the chapter of Ephesians chapter 4, that God has bridged the gap. He bridges physical gaps and he bridges spiritual gaps. And in Ephesians 4, 3, and 4, he's saying that God is the one who has called us in one body and one Spirit and one hope. It is God who bridges the gaps. Think about it this way. I'm sure that many of you have done puzzles before, and maybe even now during this time of quarantine, your family has done more puzzles than you normally might have. And when you sit down and do a puzzle, particularly a large one, it takes time. So maybe you do it over the course of a week or a couple weeks, and it sits out on your table and you've got all the pieces there, and you eventually finally finish the puzzle. And when you're finished the puzzle, you maybe take a picture of it to celebrate the fact that you finished that large puzzle. But then once you're done with it, you kind of take all the pieces apart and then you put them back in the box and you put the box back on the shelf. Now, I'm not sure if any of you have ever done this before, but I know my family has done this a couple of times where we finished a large puzzle like that, and instead of taking the pieces back apart and putting it in the box and putting it on the shelf, is that we glued the puzzle pieces together so that that puzzle would be preserved for, well, however long that puzzle would be preserved for. And I think this is the idea that Paul wants to communicate in Ephesians chapter 4, is that we can't do unity on our own. We can try and fit the pieces together as best we can, but ultimately it'll break apart, it'll fall apart, because there's really nothing holding it together. And so our sin and our pride get in the way of our relationships. But when we allow Jesus to consume our relationships, that changes everything, because then we can forgive people the way that Jesus has forgiven us. We can be patient with others, because that's how the Spirit works in our lives to help us be kind and patient and generous with other people. And so God is the one who helps bridge those gaps in relationships, in areas where we fall short, where sin gets in the way because we can't do it on our own. It's God who works in and through us. And so Paul works down through that line of thinking in chapter 4, and we encourage you to read all of chapter 4 again this week. But then in verse 17, Paul ramps up his intensity, and he's calling the believers to not live how they used to live, but to live changed lives. And so we're going to pick up in verses 20 and 21, which says this. It says, "That, however, is not the way that you learned when you heard about Christ and were taught in him accordance with the truth that is in Jesus." So Paul is encouraging the Ephesians to understand that this way of life isn't just about merely living out, is not merely just knowing ideas that we believe, but it is a life that is lived as a result of experiencing the transforming power and grace of God that we studied in chapters 1 through 3. Again, notice in verses 20 and 21 how Christ is at the center. It's him who we've learned this truth through, and it's him who we've learned about. Without Christ, we would not know the truth. Without him, we would not know this way of life that is best, that he has called us to live. It is not by our own creative thinking that we accomplish this, but it is only by God who bridges the gaps. And our task is to step out in faith and walk across those bridges, to trust that God's plans are better than ours and to obey him faithfully. But I know for many of us, especially me, is that we from time to time struggle with obeying God. I want you to think about it like this. Think about a Disney princess. Let's take the story of Cinderella, for example. Cinderella was a maidservant for her stepmother and her stepsisters, and so she scrubbed floors, she washed dishes, she was treated poorly, she wasn't living under the best conditions or circumstances. And then obviously how Disney princess movies go, through a miraculous chain of events, she marries the prince and goes to live in the castle with him. So now Cinderella is living in this castle, but imagine with me, if you will, that every day Cinderella wakes up in this castle, she puts on her old servant's outfit, her old dirty servant's outfit, where she uses to go scrub the floors and do the dishes and continue to clean and polish everything the way a servant would. That would be unheard of for a princess to do. She would certainly not be living out her identity as a princess. One of the commentators I was reading that describes this idea in chapter 4 says it this way. It says, "We have $1 million salvation, but a 5-cent response." In other words, we have $1 million sitting in front of us, but we respond to that $1 million in the same way we would respond to seeing a nickel in the middle of a parking lot. We don't often view how amazing the gospel is and how it transforms our life. And so that's what Paul is continuing over and over again to remind his readers about. He's reminding us to trust God who bridges these gaps in our lives, and we should trust him and live how God has called us to live, because he's called us to live differently and he's transformed our minds. So in the second half of Ephesians, again, Paul is going to deal practically with his readers. And in chapter 5 and chapter 6, as we're going to see over the next couple weeks, Paul is going to continue to explore some of these very specific and practical ways that we as followers of Jesus can live out our faith and truly live as transformed people. Thanks for joining us for this lesson. If you haven't already, be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel and hit the notifications bell so that you don't miss any video that we publish. Also, I hope you have a happy Memorial Day weekend, that I hope you're able to spend that with your family, just enjoying the weekend together. We hope you have a great weekend.